Wabi Sabi, and you'll find out what that means. So let's just welcome Judy Yacker.
Wabi Sabi, a Japanese aesthetic characterized by finding beauty in imperfection, impermanence, or simplicity. I keep one of my most treasured possessions in a small box in my nightstand. I take it out periodically to just look at it and remember and contemplate the many mysteries of love, marriage, and the human brain. It is precious and beautiful and priceless. My parents' marriage was not what I would call conventional. I suppose that's because my parents themselves were not what I would call conventional. My father was a housing lawyer, not to be confused with a real estate lawyer. The difference being, as he explained to me from a very young age, that real estate is market-driven, while housing is policy-driven. So you can learn things at storytelling class. My father helped develop special interest, often marginalized groups create affordable housing all over the country. The Silent Cooperative, a housing complex for the deaf community on the northwest side of Chicago, is one of his projects. He traveled a great deal for his work, often leaving my mother home alone with 4 little girls to deal with. When he returned, such joy. We'd clamber all around him and delight in the miniature soaps he'd bring us from whatever hotel he'd stayed in. I was in college before I had a full-size bar of soap for the shower. Many years later, I would marry a dentist and use miniature tubes of toothpaste for decades. It seems I was destined to have tiny toiletries. Although she always was involved in the schools and various programs, my mother didn't work when I was growing up, at least not for a paycheck. But neither was she a typical housewife. She was a notoriously terrible cook, and our house was always a mess. And that was not altogether the fault of a gaggle of young girls living there. My mother amassed stuff, paper mostly. Every surface of our house had old New Yorker magazines, articles ripped out of the newspaper, one of numerous volunteer projects she was working on, programs from something or another, newsletters and bulletins, catalogs and coupons, take-out menus, receipts, circulars, flyers. Well, you get the idea. Although my father hated all the clutter, he never fussed at my mother. I now believe that my mother suffered from undiagnosed depression and possibly hoarder syndrome that contributed to her getting irritable and snappy. My father was the calm and steady one, quick to laugh and make others laugh. Over the years, we 4 sisters often wondered what kept my parents together. They didn't fight, but there didn't seem to be much obvious affection there either. In that way, the girls could be to their mother, we blamed it all on her. How could anyone be so churlish with someone as wonderful, funny, and lovely and loving as our beloved father? We never wondered how my father's work may have gotten in the way of my mother realizing her own ambitions. We only wondered how our father could stand it. When my father was diagnosed with dementia, my mother did not become more sympathetic. She would snap, "I just told you that," when my father asked her the same question again and again. "Mom, it's the disease. You can't get mad at someone for a symptom of their disease." So easy for me to admonish. Me, with infinite patience, at least as infinite as it needed to be, as I popped in for a visit, then went home to my usually lucid husband and kids. A few years into his diagnosis, and after my mother was diagnosed with critical aortic stenosis, it became clear that my parents could not continue living independently. We moved them to an assisted living facility near my house. Though she'd never admit it, I believe my mother rather enjoyed having other people cook and clean for her, though she would holler at anyone who touched one of her precious piles of paper. And I know she enjoyed having someone else be responsible for my father's care. Everyone wanted to be on my mother's team for trips because she knew all the answers. Families of residents always stopped and talked to my mother because she knew all the inside scoop. She was the queen bee there, and my father was her constant companion. One time, my mother's legs were dangerously swollen, indicating that she was retaining too much fluid, and she had to be hospitalized briefly. My father was beside himself with worry. I called my mother and told her I was going to arrange to get my father to the hospital to visit her. He needed to lay eyes on her. I braced myself for an argument. I could already hear her telling me that that was ridiculous and way too much trouble and he'd be just fine. But instead, she said, I think that's a good idea. I told my father we would go the next day, and he told me that he would wait right here, which was the middle of the hall, until it was time. The next day I arrived and traveled with him in the special van. I used a wheelchair to get him to my mother's room because by then it was hard for him to walk. We got to her room, and from the doorway he said, Rita. She responded, hello, Julius. Ordinary greetings, but spoken in the most tender manner I'd ever heard my parents speak to each other. My dad rolled over to my mother's bedside, and they held hands as I sat on the windowsill, feeling a little like an intruder, peeping in on a very intimate moment, but unable to look away. It was as if I had never seen my parents before this moment. The visit ended, and my mother returned home soon after, and things were as they'd always been. My mother sarcastic or cranky, and my father laughing it off. My mother's stenosis progressed almost exactly as predicted. A year and 10 months after her cardiologist delivered a prognosis of 2 years max, she was in hospice, and 2 weeks later she died. I have never witnessed grief as profound as my father's was at that moment. When my younger sister got pregnant, we told each other that one of the upsides of my father's diagnosis was that he could keep receiving that good news over and over, and as if it were the first time, delighting each time he was told about it. But the converse was true as well. He relived discovering my mother had died over and over, like a scab constantly being picked off, each time as traumatic as the first, until he'd forget again. It was during one of these forgetting times that I acquired my beloved possession. For nearly 60 years, unless my father was away on business, my parents ate dinner together every night. About 2 months after my mother had died, I came to visit my dad after work. As happened some days, he was wondering where my mother was and why she was delayed. One of the caregivers gave me a paper towel. No doubt, the only piece of paper my dad could find now that my mother was gone. He had left it on what had been my mother's bed, and on it he had written, Rita, I am having super. I'll be back here about 6:55, JYY. A note, so she would be able to find him when she got home. There were some crossed out words on the note and the misspelling, which was typical of my father, who used to remind us that Einstein was also a terrible speller. His handwriting was distinctive, though not particularly elegant. It is a paper towel with scribbles on it, a misspelled word, and a small hole where the pen must have pushed through. And to me, it is the most beautiful thing in the world.
Did you say any other of your parents' possessions that were, regular, ordinary things like dishes or china or anything?
Really, the only other thing that I cherish of my parents is their wedding rings, and I keep it in the same box as that.
That's nice. Thank you, Judy.